Hi everyone, today I'm talking about an essay that is titled Self-Consciousness and the Rights of Non-Human Animals and Nature, which was originally published in 1979 by Richard A. Watson. As a general outline and summary of the whole essay, Watson first analyzes how a moral framework based in reciprocity explains and justifies how moral rights and duties are attributed, specifically to the human moral milieu. The term milieu is used in ethics to denote a moral in-group, and so when I say moral milieu, what I mean is the group of individuals who acknowledge each other's rights. Watson then goes on to examine how certain reciprocity frameworks are able to morally distinguish humans from non-humans, and then he criticizes the attribution of rights to non-humans by breaking down 4 common arguments for rights based on grounds other than reciprocity. So the big point is that Watson argues for is morality based on reciprocity, and so one's moral status relies on their moral treatment of others within a society. Watson gains inspiration from the Golden Rule, which states, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Well, I personally think he's misinterpreting the Golden Rule, and in reality it has very little to say about reciprocity. Really, the idea is that we want to be treated well, and thus we should also treat others well. It's not just that we only have to treat others well when they treat us well, or we only have to treat others well as they treat us well. To get to a reciprocity argument from the Golden Rule, there would need to be some clause about fairness or equality between members, but there's not. Really, at least to my interpretation, the Golden Rule is supposed to demonstrate that we should generalize our own sense of egoism to sympathize with the interests of others, and in doing so we would view them as individuals worthy of equal respect. And this is clearly quite a different conception than reciprocity, but to be fair, this is an insignificant part of Watson's essay, and he wasn't really trying to provide the most literal interpretation of the Golden Rule. But it's easy to point out, and I couldn't help but insert my own utilitarian welfarist agenda into the video. Anyway, to further explain the concept of moral reciprocity, Watson explains that when people accept having rights, they expect everybody to honor the right of theirs in exchange for them also honoring everybody else's right as part of the social contract. In this, rights are based on reciprocal duties, and people earn them by fulfilling those duties. If somebody freely opposes those moral duties, then the moral system can take away certain moral rights. For example, the justice system penalizing people for not following an established moral code. Some of their rights, such as a right to freedom, is taken away. And so in this, we see that the property of being a moral agent, or somebody who is able to consciously act with or against their moral duties, Watson argues that this is central to the idea of reciprocity, and under this moral framework, animals cannot understand nor fulfill duties. And since they're not moral agents, they are simply unable to participate in this reciprocal framework and are not part of the moral milieu. And this is the big takeaway of the entire essay, is that if we base our morals based in reciprocity, then by definition, we are leaving out a majority of animals and nature from direct moral consideration. To be specific, he gives a list of 6 requirements that an individual must have in order to be a moral agent, and thus have moral rights. These 6 properties are: 1, self-consciousness; 2, the capability of understanding moral principles about rights and duties; 3, freedom to act either according to or opposed to certain principles of duty; 4, understanding a given principle of duty; 5, physical capacity or potentiality of acting according to duty; and 6, intention to act according to or opposed to given principles of duty. Later on, Watson gives more discussion as to which of these characteristics certain animals do possess, but although in general Watson argues that most animals do not fulfill all of these requirements, but there are still a few non-human animal species capable of being moral agents. In the second part of this essay, Watson gives 3 different examples of reciprocity-based ethics. So I don't think this section relates much to the rest of the essay, besides just showing that reciprocity is usually restricted to the human moral relationship. So his first example of a reciprocity ethic, Watson recognizes the empirical position, which refers to a naturalistic view that human morality is a cultural artifact limited to humans. This is based on an objective observation, which is opposed to the second example that he gives, which is the supernatural position. The supernatural position can basically be exemplified by reference to Christianity or Islam, where moral codes are taken to be innately human concepts, or moral codes are ordained by supernatural gods that base their rights and duties exclusively in humans. Watson mentions these two examples of different moral positions to show that reciprocity is usually constrained only to the moral sphere. Quite contrastingly, Watson mentions the mystical position, which is technically a type of supernatural position, but the distinction is that gods have enlightened people with the information that non-human nature also has rights. And thus, the mystical position is pan-moralistic, and there's no moral distinction between humans and nature. Watson then goes on to criticize the argument of reciprocal rights to non-human worlds by saying that there's no evidence of the rights holding past people's own spiritual enlightenment, and because of this, he dismisses their status as potential rights holders without sufficient proof. And so he argues against the mystical position by referring to the spiritual origin of these moral revelations being without any natural evidence. But I would also like to bring up that Watson does not argue against the humanistic supernatural position, despite the fact that it's also based on mere moral intuition. Rather, he uses the humanistic supernatural position to demonstrate the moral separation of humans and non-humans. And so, to me, he seems kind of selective and biased in how he's choosing to represent these different positions as being either rational or not. But anyway, in the next part of the essay, Watson strengthens his argument for reciprocity by using it to examine and criticize four main arguments as to why non-human animals in nature should be given rights. First of the four, Watson talks about the ecological argument. This argument states that since all living things on Earth are interdependent via ecological communities and relationships, that we should recognize the land as having rights. In order to show that this is a faulty basis of rights, Watson shows that there is not a significant preference given to certain ecological states over others. For example, if we're just valuing the land in itself, then there's no necessary protection of existing ecosystems. And this is how Watson explains it. Quote, "If sewage from a small town were dumped into a pond, then after a while a new state of equilibrium would be established and at an optimum for the new conditions." End quote. But this conflicts with the sentiment of ecological moralists who reject the introduction of chemicals even if the system did reach a new functioning equilibrium. Thus, the basis on land and its system's integrity is a faulty one. Alternatively, Watson proposes that we might assign rights to the land based on the fact that ecosystems support the conditions necessary for human life. Watson thinks that this is a stronger argument than appeal to mere existence, but the crucial thing is that value attributed based on our needs means that nature does not have any rights in itself. It only gets protection for the sake of human rights. Therefore, any rights assigned to nature or the land are actually secondary rights rather than the primary intrinsic rights that humans have. Nevertheless, Watson admits that it may be useful to talk about the land having rights insofar as that it's prudent to treat it as such given the ecological crisis, even if it doesn't actually have rights intrinsically. The second argument for non-human rights is the prudential argument. This argument is a classic response to the claim by René Descartes that animals are machines. The prudential argument states that if we treat animals as machines, then we're disposed to treat humans similarly. Even if animals are machines, we should treat them as if they're not to avoid the impacts on human morality. Similarly to the ecological argument, this does not show that animals have intrinsic primary rights, only secondary rights, but it may be functionally useful to treat them as if they did. The third argument is the sentimental argument, which refers to the idea that Any sentient, conscious being has rights based on the fact that they are able to feel, both suffer bad feelings and enjoy good ones. Watson claims that this argument is weak because it depends on the fact of animals not being machines, of which many people are not convinced. And further, he says it's weak because there's not an explanation as to why sentience, or the feeling of pain, should entitle someone to rights. Quote, "Why does the mere possession of sentience endow an entity with the right to life or relief from unnecessary suffering?" End quote. So I personally think it's weird when someone doesn't immediately see the link between sentience and suffering and moral considerability. Of course, Watson is being very strict in maintaining that only reciprocal moral agents ought to be given moral consideration because that's what he's trying to argue. But I find it hard to imagine that he sees no innate link between sentience and moral significance. For example, he thinks that there is, quote, "no explanation why the characteristic of sentience should entitle an entity to rights," end quote, such as the right not to be made to suffer unnecessarily. Later, Watson refers to some special senses of animal ethicists who simply feel that sentience entitles the possession of rights and relief from unnecessary suffering. But Watson is not impressed by this and demands a real moral argument to make that connection. At this point, I attribute his callousness to his commitment to a reciprocity-based moral milieu. However, to me, it does seem a little psychopathic how someone is able to so quickly dismiss suffering, requiring a logical argument in order to justify its wrongness. In this portion of the essay talking about the sentimental argument, Watson spends a lot of time talking about and criticizing Peter Singer's writing, and he is the person who basically popularized the sentimental argument, although I don't think Peter Singer would refer to it as a sentimental argument. But basically, the main point of Singer is that all sentient beings have a right to life, free from needless suffering, and that they are the moral equals of humans. There's an excerpt from Singer where he makes an argument of animal rights, where just as we recognize that men and women are equal, yet do not have the exact same rights due to their physical differences, humans and animals may be considered equal while still not being granted the exact same rights. Watson attempts to undo this reasoning by explaining that men and women have the same psychological capacities, and so although they may have different rights, since they are moral agents, they all have the same claim to rights, like that of bodily autonomy. And animals lack those characteristics and understandings, and thus they don't have the equivalent right. I feel that just as in multiple other cases within this essay, Watson just imposes his understanding of rights as a way to disprove other rights theories. Like, of course, if you base your theory on reciprocity and then analyze alternative theories according to those same conditions, then you're going to find that those alternative theories don't fulfill the standard that you set up for them. And so I think the essay has a lot of good things to say in its analysis, but it's not very useful information in my opinion, since I don't agree with the original premise of his on which he's building all these counter-arguments. The original quote by Singer is just supposed to explain the technical difference between equal treatment and equal consideration, but by making this argument against Singer, all I think Watson really did was further show how his theory is different from others, not actually why Singer's conception is invalid on objective grounds. He concludes the section on the sentimental argument by saying that since humans are often appalled by the bad treatment of animals, we may assign those animals secondary rights to be free of unnecessary suffering based on the fact that humans don't like it. So again, he says that animals don't have any rights in themselves, but we may give them protections as secondary rights insofar as it supports the human right to happiness. And the last argument discussed by Watson for assigning rights to non-humans is the contractual argument. So this argument states that rights should be given to nature because humans are pleased by the existence of peaceful nature. The quintessential example of this is Christopher D. Stone's legal work in assigning rights to natural objects under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Under this amendment, collective entities may be given legal status of person if there is sufficient human interests calling for its protection. But of course, once again, these are only extensions of human rights, and nature does not have the capacity for moral reciprocation that Watson so desires. In fact, Watson calls the contractual argument contractual because nature is openly treated as property of humans, but is just given protections on behalf of human interests. To conclude, in the last and final part of the essay, Watson explains that some animals are probably self-conscious and understand some moral principles, and therefore they are moral entities, although they're not fully moral agents. And then even on occasion, animals may intend to act with reference to moral principles and thus are sometimes moral agents. The relevant difference between moral entities and moral agents is the holding of the sixth characteristic necessary for rights holding, which is the intent to act in reference to moral principles. This distinction has to do with the difference between being able to conceive of moral principles and actually being able to act with reference to them. Thus, Watson leaves open the problem that animals may only sometimes act with intention to moral principles in this way, and so those individuals may at some times have the sixth characteristics, while at other times may not. And for animals like this that walk the line between moral entity and moral agent, Watson suggests establishing, on the grounds of reciprocity, at least an intrinsic right to life and a right to relief of unnecessary suffering. Further, he states that based on the prudential and sentimental arguments, self-conscious animals able to communicate their interests, but who do not understand moral principles, should be given secondary rights to life and relief from unnecessary suffering. But again, this is all ultimately based on human interests as per Watson's analysis of those arguments. And lastly, non-self-conscious nature should be assigned rights according to the ecological and contractual arguments. However, I find it curious that he did not specify should be granted secondary rights based on the ecological and contractual arguments. I only assume that based on his earlier discussion, he assumes that any rights of non-conscious nature is necessarily secondary. I should note that Watson is only talking about rights in this essay, and so although we can't assign intrinsic rights to most animals and nature directly on the moral agent conception of rights, we can still give intrinsic value of some sort to nature and animals on some other reciprocity framework. For example, animals may not be moral agents nor participate in moral agreements, but by harvesting their meat, we do take something from them, and so maybe we should just return the favor or make up that debt to them by treating them well while they are alive. And I think this is a much more humane reciprocity argument than Watson's, since animals don't need to intentionally fulfill their half of the deal since it's done for them.